Text message came in at 6:17 on a Tuesday morning, and I was already awake because my alarm had gone off at 5:50, and I'd been lying there staring at the ceiling, doing the thing I do before a long travel day, which is mentally walking through every folder in my bag, every document, every laptop charger, every contingency. I'm a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Columbus that specializes in commercial real estate disputes. My job is to know where every piece of paper is and what it means and when it's due. I have been doing this since I was 22, and I am 31 now, and I am very good at it. My phone lit up on the nightstand. The sender was my brother. The message read, "We had to make some decisions. Don't freak out. We're in Austin now. The accounts are handled. You'll figure it out. You always do." I read it once, then again. Then I set the phone face down on the nightstand and finished getting dressed. My name is Dana Kowalski. My brother's name is Brett. He is 38 years old, and for most of our adult lives, I have been watching him become someone I didn't recognize in pieces. The way you watch paint peel off a wall so slowly you keep thinking it might stop. Let me go back. Our father, Raymond, had a massive stroke 2.5 years before any of this happened. He survived it, but the left side of his body didn't fully come back, and his speech became slow and effortful in a way that humiliated him because he had spent his whole career as a high school history teacher, and talking had been his instrument. He was 67 when it happened. My mother had passed when Brett and I were teenagers. A car accident on I-71, December. Black ice. The kind of thing that doesn't give you any room to prepare for the world without her in it. So when my father had his stroke, there was just the two of us. Brett had been living in Cincinnati at the time, going through his second divorce, working a sales job he described as temporary for about 4 consecutive years. He had charm in the way certain people do, where you don't immediately notice it's being used on you. He could make a room feel warmer just by walking into it. My father loved him in that particular parental way, where the child who needs the most becomes the one who gets the most without anyone deciding that's the rule. It was just the weather of our family. Brett needed more. It rained more on Brett. After my father's stroke, I drove to his house in Dayton 3 or 4 times a month. I managed his bills and his insurance claims and his prescriptions. I helped him set up a system so he could use his phone with one hand. I coordinated with his physical therapist and his neurologist and the home health aide who came Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I did this while working 45 hours a week and driving a total of about 90 minutes round trip each visit. I don't say this looking for credit. I say it because it matters to what came later. Brett showed up about 3 months after the stroke. He said he wanted to be closer to Dad. He'd lost the Cincinnati apartment anyway. The lease situation had gotten complicated. And could he stay in Dad's spare bedroom for a month or 2 while he got back on his feet? My father said yes immediately, the way he always said yes to Brett. 2 months turned into 8. 8 months turned into a 1.5 years. I told myself Brett being there was helpful. He drove my father to some appointments. He cooked dinner some nights. What I noticed, but filed away as something probably innocent, was that Brett started asking me questions about the financial accounts I helped manage. Not aggressive questions, casual ones. Conversational. "Hey, do you use that same brokerage Dad mentioned? Is his savings and his checking at the same bank or different ones?" I answered because I had no frame for not answering. He was my brother. He was living with our father. It felt like reasonable information sharing. Then I noticed my father seemed uncertain about things he'd previously been clear on. He couldn't remember if a particular bill had been paid. He thought the internet had been canceled when it hadn't. Small confusions that I told myself were the stroke, the cognitive after effects, the fog that had settled in some of his processing. I told myself that for several months. The moment I stopped telling myself that was a Sunday in March. I had come to Dayton for the day, and my father and I were sitting at the kitchen table after lunch, and he said very quietly that Brett had explained to him the accounts needed to be consolidated. Simplified. My father said Brett had told him having the money in multiple places was causing fees and that it made more sense together. He said Brett had helped him sign some paperwork. I kept my face still. My father was watching me with an expression I recognized. He had taught history for 30 years. He could read a room. He looks like a man who had agreed to something and was only now noticing the small cold feeling that comes after. I drove home that evening and called my college roommate's husband, Derek Paulson. Derek is a trust and estate attorney in Columbus who has handled a few things for my firm on referral and who I trusted completely. I told him what I'd seen. I told him about the paperwork my father had mentioned but couldn't describe clearly. I told him about the consolidation conversation. Derek listened without interrupting, which is a skill, and when I finished, he said, "What's your father's current cognitive status on paper?" I said he had never been formally assessed post-stroke. Derek said, "That's the first thing we fix, tomorrow." That was the beginning of 6 months of methodical, careful, very quiet work. Derek connected me with an elder law attorney named Ms. Okafor, who worked in Dayton and who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. Ms. Okafor was practical in the way that people who have seen the worst of human behavior tend to be. Not cynical, just accurate. She arranged for a formal cognitive assessment of my father through his neurologist. The results were important. My father had mild cognitive impairment in certain areas, but was assessed as having legal decision-making capacity. That meant anything he had signed was presumptively valid. It also meant we had a baseline on record. Miss Presumpt, Okafor pulled my father's account records and found that over the previous 11 months, Brett had been added as a joint account holder on 2 of my father's 3 bank accounts. The third account, the one with the most significant balance, a savings account my father had held for 30 years and which contained most of what he'd accumulated across a teaching career, had been the subject of a transfer request. The request had not yet processed. It was sitting in a review queue because a teller had flagged the transaction amount as unusual for the account's history. The bank's fraud unit had put a 48-hour hold on it pending verification. That hold had been placed 6 days before I called Derek. It had 3 days left. Ms. Okafor contacted the bank's Elder Financial Abuse Division directly, a department I hadn't known existed, and explained the situation. The hold was extended pending investigation. The savings account was flagged. A case number was opened. I drove to the bank myself that Thursday and met with a specialist named Mr. Tran, who reviewed the documentation Ms. Okafor had already sent over and confirmed the funds were protected while the investigation was open. I want to explain something about the next part because people who've only seen this kind of situation from the outside sometimes assume the right move is immediate confrontation, call the police that day, change the locks, throw him out. I understand the impulse. I had it. But Miss Okafor was clear. Acting on that impulse before we had documentation could actually harm my father's legal position. If Brett had power of attorney paperwork, even paperwork obtained through manipulation, a rushed confrontation might give him grounds to accelerate the transfer before we could stop it. We needed the paper trail complete before we moved. So I went to Dayton that weekend and I behaved completely normally. I helped my father with his exercises. I made dinner. Brett was there, relaxed in the way people who believe they've already won tend to be relaxed. He asked me how work was going. I said fine. He said something about Columbus traffic. I agreed. I watched him for the whole evening the way I watched the other side in a deposition. Not looking for anger, just information. Before I left, I took my father for a short walk around the block, just the 2 of us, and I said very carefully that I wanted to make sure he knew his savings account was his and that nothing about it needed to change. My father looked at me for a long moment and nodded once, the kind of nod that meant he understood more than he'd said. 2 weeks later, I arranged for a power of attorney to be properly drawn up, with my father's full knowing consent, assessed and witnessed, naming me as his financial agent. Ms. Okafor oversaw it personally. My father signed it without hesitation. He said he'd been waiting for me to ask. I also had new locks installed on the house while Brett was out one afternoon. I didn't tell Brett. The locksmith came at noon. By 2 o'clock, the only person with a key was my father, and a copy was at Ms. Okafor's office. The consulting trip to Phoenix had been on my calendar since January. 4 days, a real estate litigation seminar the firm was sending me to, non-negotiable. I told my father about it. I did not tell Brett I was going, but I watched his reaction when my father mentioned it at dinner that Saturday, which was the Saturday before I left. Brett nodded slowly in that way he had, the way that looked like casual agreement, and meant something was being calculated behind it. I left on a Monday. By Tuesday morning, the text arrived. I put my phone down. I finished getting dressed. I zipped my bag and I checked every compartment the way I always do. Then I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and took 4 slow breaths, which is not a mindfulness practice. It's just the thing I do when I need my hands to stop shaking before they need to type. I forwarded the text to Ms. Okafor. Then I called Mr. Tran's direct line. He had already been notified by the fraud division. An attempt had been made to transfer the funds from the flagged savings account that morning, initiated through online banking with credentials that had been set up from a device registered to Brett. The transfer had hit the fraud flag and been blocked automatically. The funds were not moving. The block also generated a federal notification because the transfer attempt crossed a threshold requiring it. It was no longer just a civil matter. I opened my laptop and logged into the camera system I had installed at my father's house 6 weeks earlier. My father had agreed to it. I had told him it was for his safety given the stroke history, and that was true. It was also for this. The footage from that morning showed Brett at my father's kitchen table, laptop open, my father sitting nearby watching television. Brett made 2 phone calls. On the second one, I could hear him clearly enough. He was asking someone about Austin. I flew home Wednesday instead of Friday. Ms. Okafor met me at my office at 8 in the morning on Thursday. By noon, a detective from the Dayton Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit, a woman named Detective Reyes, who had the energy of someone who had heard every possible version of this story and still managed to be angry on behalf of the victim every time, had reviewed the bank records, the camera footage, the text message, and the documentation of the power of attorney transfer attempt. She said, "Is your father willing to cooperate?" I said, "Call him yourself." She did. My father spoke to Detective Reyes for 40 minutes. He was slow and deliberate the way he always was now, but he was clear. He knew what he had signed. He knew what he had not understood when he signed it. He said, near the end of the call, that he had trusted Brett because Brett was his son, and that he had also known, in the part of himself he didn't say things out loud, that something was wrong. He said he was glad Dana had the documents. That was the first time I cried during any of this. Not then, but later that night, driving back from Dayton after I'd sat with my father for a few hours. I cried in the car because he'd said Dana had the documents like that was the most natural thing in the world. Like, of course I would have what we needed. Like he had known from the beginning that I would be the one to handle this. I don't know if that's love or just habit, but it felt like both. Brett called from Austin that Thursday evening. I didn't answer. He called again Friday morning, and I let that one go too. He texted, "Dana, pick up. The card isn't working. The transfer didn't go through. There's been some kind of mistake." He texted, "I was helping Dad. You need to understand that." He texted, "Call me back before you do something you regret." I read them in order, and then I forwarded all 3 to Ms. Okafor and Detective Reyes. Saturday morning, he called my father directly. My father answered, which we had not prevented him from doing, and which I had not asked him not to do because my father is an adult and that is his son, and it was not my call to make. My father told me afterward that Brett had said the transfer was supposed to be a surprise, that he had been planning to invest the money in a business in Austin and share the returns with Dad, that it was an opportunity and Dana didn't understand. My father said he had listened to the whole thing quietly and then said, "Brett, the accounts are Dana's responsibility now." And then he had hung up. I wrote that down in a notepad, the exact wording as my father remembered it, and added it to the case file. What followed was not the version of justice that looks good in a movie. There was no courtroom scene, There was no moment where Brett stood in front of a judge, and I watched his face when the verdict came down. Real legal processes are conference calls and document requests and emails between attorneys and long stretches where nothing visible seems to be happening while things are actually happening. Brett had an attorney in Austin. The attorney quickly determined that the power of attorney I held was properly executed, witnessed, and dated prior to the transfer attempt, which meant Brett's claim that he had been authorized to manage my father's finances was not supportable. The fraudulent transfer attempt across state lines carried federal exposure that his attorney did not want. The joint account status on the two smaller accounts had been obtained through a process that Ms. Iscap Okafor documented as meeting the legal standard for undue influence given my father's cognitive history and the circumstances. That gave us grounds for removal. The resolution came in stages. The joint accounts were returned to sole ownership by my father. A civil agreement was reached in which Brett acknowledged the transfer had been unauthorized and agreed to a structured repayment schedule for $12,000 he had withdrawn from the joint accounts over the preceding year. Grocery runs, gas, several charges I recognized as none of those things. The federal matter resulted in a deferred prosecution agreement with conditions including no contact with my father's financial accounts and mandatory reporting of his address for 2 years. Brett did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that, because the comments on videos like this are always full of people saying they should be locked up, and sometimes they're right and sometimes the math just doesn't work out that way. The priority was protecting my father's assets and my father's dignity, and on both of those things we succeeded completely. I drove to Dayton the weekend after the civil agreement was signed, and my father and I had dinner at the kitchen table, and I told him it was done. He was quiet for a while, and then he said he was sorry I'd had to do all of that. I told him he didn't have anything to apologize for. He said he knew that. He said it anyway. I repainted the spare bedroom that winter. Not immediately. I sat with it being Brett's room for a while because I wasn't sure what it meant to change it. Then one Saturday in January, I drove to Home Depot and stood in the paint aisle for 15 minutes and chose a color called Dusty Sage, because my father had mentioned once that my mother had wanted to paint the bedroom something green, but they'd never gotten around to it. I painted it in a day. It took 2 coats. My father came and stood in the doorway when I finished and looked at the color for a long time and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of answer. I still drive to Dayton twice a month. I still handle the insurance claims and the prescriptions and the PT coordination. The difference is I do not go home at the end of those visits feeling like I am quietly disappearing. My father thanks me now in a way he didn't used to, not because he appreciates me more than before, but because something that was in the way of him saying it out loud is gone. Last month he told me I had my mother's way of seeing things clearly when other people couldn't. He said it like it was the most ordinary observation. It was the best thing anyone has said to me in years. Here's what I want to say directly, and I mean this for anyone sitting with something they've been telling themselves is probably nothing. Brett didn't become this person overnight. The entitlement built in layers, slowly, across decades, in a family that loved him more than it held him accountable. Every time someone filled in the gaps, Brett left. Every time the consequences were softened. Every time I drove to Dayton and fixed something while he sat on the couch, we were teaching him that the gap would always be filled. That he didn't need to be the kind of person who filled it himself. I do not hate my brother. That would require a kind of sustained energy I've decided not to spend on him. What I feel is closer to grief. For the person he might have been. For the family we might have had. For my father who loved him and got this in return. That grief is real, and I don't think it goes away entirely. But here is the other thing, the thing I actually want you to take with you. I did not rescue my father by being a good person. Being a good person is not sufficient. I rescued my father by being organized, by calling an attorney, by knowing the name of the bank's elder abuse division, by having documentation that was current and correct and dated, by doing the work. Love is not a substitute for preparation. Caring is not a substitute for records. If you have an elderly parent and someone in your family has access to their finances and you have had even one moment of quiet unease about it, one moment where you told yourself it was probably nothing, I want you to take that moment seriously. Call an estate attorney. Ask your parents' bank if they have an elder financial protection program. Most of them do. Document what you know while you know it. Not because your family member will definitely do what Brett did. Maybe they won't. Maybe it is nothing. But if it isn't nothing, you will be glad you have the folder. I've thought a lot about what made Brett believe he could do this. Not the logistics of it, the account access, the forged paperwork, the transfer attempt, but the deeper thing underneath all of that. The belief that it would work, that I would find out and be too hurt, too confused, too tangled up in family feeling to do anything effective about it. That's the assumption that made every step of his plan possible, and it's the assumption he'd been allowed to build for decades because it had always, until now, been correct. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not what he did in those final months, but what we all did in the 20 years before them. Every time someone smoothed over what Brett left undone. Every time my father said yes when the answer that would have actually helped Brett was no. Every time I drove to Dayton and fixed the thing Brett had let fall apart without ever saying out loud that this pattern had a cost, we thought we were being kind. We were being something else. I don't think people like Brett wake up one day and decide to become someone who steals from their own father. I think they arrive there through a long series of smaller decisions, each one made easier by the fact that the last one had no real consequence. Character isn't fixed. It's built, or it isn't, over time, by what we're asked to carry and what we're allowed to put down. Brett was allowed to put down almost everything for a very long time. What I watched happen to him is what happens when a person never has to develop the part of themselves that shows up for something hard. There's something I want to say about what it took to handle this the way I did, because I think people sometimes hear a story like this and think the person who did the documenting and the attorney calls and the careful 6-month preparation was somehow cold, or calculating, or less loving because she wasn't falling apart. That's not what was happening. I was terrified every single day of those 6 months. I was grieving my brother while he was still alive and making plans and sending me texts. The discipline wasn't instead of the feeling. It was how I kept the feeling from making the decisions. That's what I mean when I say that caring is not a substitute for preparation. I cared about my father more than I have words for, but caring alone would have left him without his savings and without recourse, because caring alone, without the power of attorney, without Mr. Tran's name in my phone, without the camera footage, without Derek's call that Monday morning, would have been nothing but grief after the fact. Love that doesn't build the structures to protect what it loves is just an emotion. It's real, but it isn't enough. My father is doing well. He has his accounts. He has his house with the sage green spare bedroom. He has his Tuesday and Thursday aid, his PT appointments, his slow and deliberate way of saying exactly what he means. Last week he told me he'd been rereading some of his old history lecture notes. He said he missed teaching. I told him maybe he could teach me something sometime. He thought about that for a moment and said he'd think about what subject. I'm still waiting. I have a feeling whatever he picks will be worth it.